Welcome back. We are resuming our complete Android developer docs discussion, wherein we are now going to talk about another topic, one of the topics in the core topics of Android developers documents, which is handle activity state changes. So, when activity is being used by your user, there could be state changes in the activity and how to deal with those changes. Let's move to developer docs and see how to make this happen. Now here we are in the Android developer docs, handle activity state changes. Different events, some user triggered and some system triggered, can cause activity to transition from one state to another. And one of such events would be that the developer themselves, they fire an intent taking the user from activity 1 to activity 2. And we have seen how in such a scenario the different methods would get called up to establish the activity life cycle of the both the activities, right? Now we'll discuss and touch upon these issues a little more. The first one would be the configuration change occurs. So when the configuration change occurs, which basically typically would mean the user has started using the phone in a landscape orientation, and earlier they were using it in portrait, there is a configuration change that is happening. And although it might seem that there is no change or there is nothing significantly different than what was earlier in portrait, but it is. What really happens is that Android, because it is because your user is primarily using it in mobile phone, they actually get more space to view anything in different dimension when they are doing it in the landscape orientation, right? So there is a significant change in the activity behavior, and that's why the Android OS, it calls different methods such as on pause, on stop, and on destroy for the previous activity. And for the new activity that has been created for the landscape mode, these three methods are triggered. Use a combination of view models, the on-save instance state method, and persistent local storage to preserve an activity's UI state across configuration changes. So when such configuration changes occur, you have to use these three options that you have. View models. Now view models, we did talk about these things earlier also, but we did not really discuss them. We'll discuss them when we start discussing the architecture components here, right? So not to worry if you don't really understand what view model is. We will discuss these things later. On save instance state method we have already discussed, and persistent local storage also we'll discuss later. So you can basically use these three options to store your activity state to be used later in case required. Handling multi-window cases. Now this is something which has come up after Android 7.0, which is API level 24. This was not something which was provided earlier. So now as you know, the users can have two mobile apps running at the same time. And how does a developer take care of such a scenario? So what really needs to be done is that first thing is you have to understand what multi-window lifecycle is. We will learn about this when the time comes. This will be covered at the right time, which is under the handling app links. We will talk after this. We will talk about multi-window support. So right now, just to give you an overview, we are right now here, and then when we reach here, we'll talk about this multi-window lifecycle. It basically is the same concepts remain the same here as well, but because there are two activities that are getting involved, so we will discuss these things later, right? In case of multi-window life cycle or multi-window support, what you need to do is you need to understand that when a user is using an app A and an app B both at the same time, typically what happens is that users, they have a YouTube app being played in half of their mobile phone, and they are also chatting with somebody in app as using app B, right? In such a case, while they are typing in app B to chat with somebody, the app B will be in an on resume state there, so its on resume method has been called, and app A on pause has been called, and vice versa, right? I mean, if they go to app A and bring it in focus, they start interacting with app A, then app A's on resume method is called, and app B's on pause method is called, right? So we'll discuss this thing later in multi-window support. Activity or dialogue appears in the foreground. So this you must have seen a lot of times. You're interacting with an app and then a dialogue pops up because of some action that you did. So if a new activity or dialogue appears in the foreground, taking focus and partially covering the activity in progress, the covered activity loses focus and enters the pause state, and that's when the on pause method is called, right? And when the covered activity returns to the foreground and regains focus, it calls on resume. If a new activity or dialogue appears in the foreground, taking focus and completely covering the activity in the progress, the covered activity loses focus and enters the stop state. So I don't really think that it's very conceptual or something which we really need to understand. You just need to know this and come back to these same developer docs whenever required. The intent of this entire playlist or entire videos session is that I want you to know where all you can find what all things, right? So tomorrow if you're making an app and you are dealing with a dialogue which is going to appear up, you should know that the activity which has brought up the dialogue will be going in these states, right? And you can take actions accordingly. User taps back button, another scenario wherein the user has tapped the back button, and the activity will then transition through on pause, on stop, and on destroy callbacks. In addition to being destroyed, the activity is also removed from the back stack. So what is a back stack? Back stack is nothing but a stack of instances that Android OS maintains in itself, and it is basically done so that it can be reused. These instances can be reused whenever required. And if you have observed this, let's say you are using WhatsApp and you happen to click on one of the chats. When you click on back button, then you will see that this at this point in time, when you click the back button, this instance wherein you were able to see one chat is gone now, right? So that is basically taken out from the stack because you as a user you told the Android OS system that I do not require this, so the Android OS is not going to maintain it in its own stack. It is important to note that by default the on save instance state callback does not fire in this case because you have pressed the back button. The on save instance state callback will not be fired in this case. This behavior is based on the assumption that the user tapped the back button with no expectation of returning to the same instance of the activity, right? So like I said, the user has clearly communicated that the user does not want to see what he or she is seeing right now, and that's why they clicked on the back button, right? However, you can override the on back press method to implement some custom behavior, for example confirm quit dialog. So if you have observed this, a lot of apps they do this. They ask you to confirm if you really want to get out of the app or get out of an activity without performing some essential tasks, right? So you can use this method, on back press method. This is something which you can override, which is basically called when the user presses the back button. If you override the on back press method, we still highly recommend that you invoke super.on back press from your overridden method, otherwise the back button behavior may be jarring to the user. So this is one of the recommendations. You should call the super implementation of on back pressed as well. System kills app process. If an app is in the background and the system needs to free up additional memory for foreground app, the background app can be killed by the system to free up more memory. So if you remember, we had discussed this part wherein we were discussing what is the chance of the Android OS likelihood of being killed. What is the likelihood of an activity being killed by the Android OS if it is in what state it is in, right? So most likely the OS will kill an activity if it is in the stopped or empty or destroyed state, and if it is in the foreground then it's least likely, right? So app processes are killed as per this table. We have already discussed this, so we'll not discuss it anymore. Now next topic is actually test your activities, which comes after activity state changes. Test your activities is basically about how to test your activities that you are making as a developer. You might want to see how your activity behaves when another activity interrupts your activity, or the system destroys it, or the user places your activity in a new windowing environment such as PIP or multi-window. So there are a couple of methods how you can test the activities. Normally a developer, the way they develop it is that they have certain libraries that they make use of to test the activities. And now you have a library named as Android X Test. In 2018 we had this release of in Google I/O release. Google released this library which can be used to test your library, to test your activities. It basically provides us with activity scenario, which is a cross-platform API that you can use in local unit tests, on device integration tests alike. I am not going to discuss this at length because one, it is primarily in Kotlin, and Kotlin is not something which we are going to use as a method of communication in these sessions. Two, the reason is that we will be discussing this when the time comes in testing. As you can see, there are best practices. Last section of the topics is testing, so we'll discuss it then. I don't want to waste my time and your time in discussing something which cannot be discussed by just touching upon these things, like, because one, like I said, this is all Kotlin. Don't want to discuss Kotlin right now, and I think Kotlin as a language needs some more time to really prove its mettle so as to really be taken seriously. Okay, so let's not waste our time on testing our activities right now. Let's talk to you in next video, wherein we will start discussing tasks and backstack. See you, take care, and subscribe to the channel so as to stay connected.